Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. And I'm sending you all a big hug because every one of you that is listening to this podcast or whatever it is that you're listening to on YouTube, well, you're all very special to me. But before I continue with the story, let's remind you where we are at now. Iris married Ken. And she did so on the understanding that she never ever wanted to have children. She really thought having children was a big setback in your life and that children were demanding and expensive and she just didn't want kids. And Ken was very understanding about that and he loved Iris so much that he agreed to this. But unfortunately what neither of them anticipated that Ken's sister would commit suicide and as a result they would be responsible for raising her, Ken's sister, 14-year-old boy called Jake. And Iris is suddenly beginning to discover that she's warming to this young boy called Jake. And she didn't expect that to happen. She's starting to develop maternal feelings. And she can't understand that because she really thought she didn't want children. But isn't it amazing how circumstances can suddenly change your feelings about things? But anyway, as they're at the Ozarks on a camping holiday, some strange things have started to happen. So let's find out where this story leads. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with the final part of this story tonight. As Jake and her husband Ken had gone off fishing, Iris decided to clear up the breakfast things. She hummed happily to herself as she did so. Once she'd put everything away, she set up a single camping chair outside the tent, which overlooked the prepossessing views of the silvery lake, where trees like hunchback old men dipped their long leafy green boughs into the water. Birds of so many unique and dazzling varieties nestled in the trees. She could hear their happy, cheerful trills. The sky was so perfectly blue that day, without a single fluffy cloud in sight. The mellow sun glistened on the pristine silvery surface of the water, reflecting the trees and the sky in its all-expansive mirror. Iris was surprised how content she suddenly felt, as if all was terribly well in her world. She was realizing, to her surprise, that she was growing increasingly fond of Jake, and she liked the very well-behaved teenager very much. He's a lot like Ken, she thought. She covered her bare arms with insect repellent and sat out on the camping chair and began to read her book. It was a detective novel with a murder mystery that had kept her on the edge of her seat as she tried desperately to figure out who could possibly be the perpetrator of the grisly crime. There were so many suspects in the spine-chilling story, so anyone could have murdered the young girl that had been found lying dead at a bus shelter, where her body had been propped up to make her look as if she was still waiting for the 9:32 bus to arrive. No one had noticed the strangle marks around her neck that had been hidden by a thick woolly scarf. The young girl in the story had offended so many people, from family members to friends, with her angry outbursts, as she had been known to have a fiery temper that had matched her bright red hair. So who had killed Sheena Farrell? That was the million-dollar question that Iris was hanging on. She was struck with the overwhelming sense that she was being watched. She'd continuously look up from her book and look towards the woods. Was someone there, she wondered? Was someone possibly watching her from behind the trees? No, surely not. They were in the middle of nowhere. It was her imagination playing tricks on her. Of course it was. Iris was sure that her thrilling suspense in the book of the young girl sitting at the bus stop had suddenly made her feel apprehensive about her own environment, as if the evil villain from the book she was reading, who had strangled the young girl called Sheena at the bus stop, had suddenly morphed into her reality, and was surreptitiously hiding behind the trees, furtively watching and waiting to make her his very next victim. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Iris reprimanded herself. "You're reading a story, for goodness sake, a fictitious story. Don't get carried away, woman." Iris glanced over at the distance and could see both Jake and her husband fishing, and she chastised herself for being so overwrought. Maybe she shouldn't read impressionable stories like this, that tickle your nerves when you're camping out in the middle of nowhere, she thought, because the power of suggestion can be a formidable foe. The day was so prepossessingly beautiful, the sun generous in her congenial warmth as it caressed her arms, and then suddenly she found her eyelids fluttering, as if they were struggling to fight off the need to remain open. But it was a losing battle that Iris was losing quickly, as she surrendered to the silent urges of sleep. Iris woke with quite the start, wondering how long she'd been fast asleep. Something appeared to be tickling her feet, so she looked down at her feet to find on the ground was a huge bunch of alpine flowers. They were so beautiful. She assumed Jake must have gathered them for her, and the kind gesture filled her heart with a warm feeling. What a lovely thing for him to do! What a lovely, delightful teenager he is, she thought. She glanced towards the two figures fishing at the end of the lake. Jake must have gone off on his own and picked those flowers especially for me. Bless his cotton socks. Of course, they won't last terribly long, but I will put them in a glass of water nevertheless, and enjoy them while they last. What a kind thing of him to do. She marvelled that Jake, in the middle of the fishing trip, had managed to go searching for flowers especially for her. I don't know why I ever had doubts about that lovely young man, she thought to herself. He's an asset to our family. It was a while later when Jake and Ken returned from their fishing, laughing and chatting happily together, that Iris found herself filled with so much love as she stared at the two of them. Jake was holding up a large fish. Look what I caught, Aunt Iris. This is the first time I've ever fished, and I got a much bigger fish than Uncle Ken did. Uncle Ken only got 2 stragglers, didn't you, Uncle Ken? He's got the magic touch for sure, said Ken, presenting the tiny fish to his wife. Well, Jake very proudly presented his big fish. You've excelled yourself, Jake, said Iris, impulsively rushing towards him to give him a big hug. What was that for, Aunt Iris? Asked Jake, looking somewhat bewildered by Iris's spontaneous burst of affection. It's just a fish, Aunt Iris, he teased. It's no big deal. Oh, but it's much more than a fish. You have no idea, Jake. What an impressive specimen you caught. And this is your first time fishing, is it not? But I'm just so pleased you're here with us in the Ozarks. But even more, I am so touched by the flowers you left me. I put them in a glass vase. Well, actually a glass of water to be more precise. They're so very pretty. Thank you so much, Jake, for going to the trouble of picking them for me. It was such a thoughtful, generous thing for you to do. I can assure you that Ken has never done something like that for me in the middle of the wilderness. I am so touched by your kindness. Touched to the quick, actually. But Aunt Iris, I didn't pick you those flowers, said Jake, secretly wishing he had, for his Aunt Iris seemed so delighted by the flowers. I wouldn't exactly know where to get flowers like that. Iris's face paled. But if you didn't get me these flowers, who did? I was sitting on a camping chair outside our tent, watching you fish from a distance and reading a very gripping detective novel. I felt as if someone was watching me from the woods, I really did. But I thought the suspenseful story I was engrossed in had made my imagination run away with me. I fell fast asleep on that chair and woke up to find something tickling my feet. And I looked down at my feet, and there was a bunch of flowers. So whoever got them for me must have come right up to me while I was sleeping, and was so quiet I never even heard them. It is creeping me out just to think about it. Remember, someone filled my basket with firewood, said Ken. So someone is definitely out there. We're clearly not alone here. I don't think whoever the person is, that they can be bad. I mean, they brought you flowers, Aunt Iris, and they got firewood for you, Uncle Ken. If they had an insidious agenda towards us, they wouldn't do such kind things for us, would they? I remember an assembly About 3 weeks ago, a pastor came to our school, and he says you will know them by their fruit. And that is like talking about people. When people do kind things, then they're not mean. And when people do wicked things, then they're evil. So whoever's doing these things for us, they've got to be good, haven't they? Well, that's a very good point, Jake, said Iris. Nevertheless, I don't like the thought of someone coming up to our camp when I'm fast asleep and leaving flowers at my feet. I mean, whoever they are. Well, they're obviously living rough, aren't they? What if they're an escaped convict? Or even if they've escaped a mental asylum or something. You hear stories about those kind of things all the time. Oh, dear me, my heart is beginning to flutter rather wildly in my chest. Everything is very alarming. The thought that somebody could be out there watching us. As Jake very eloquently pointed out, love, not everybody is bad. And it was a very sweet thing to do to leave you flowers at your feet, even if it was perhaps a little inappropriate. The problem with you is you read far too many detective novels, and they fill your head with all kinds of wild suggestions. Even so, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to have a look around the place, see if I can see anyone suspicious lurking around. You, Jake, stay with your aunt, will you? She looks as if she's had her feathers quite ruffled by the family tabby, you could say, said Ken teasingly. Joke as much as you like, Ken, but I don't like this one little bit, said Iris, shuddering. Someone is watching us, and it's freaking me the hell out. I know leaving flowers for me was very sweet, but there's something about it that is so very unsettling. There could be anybody out there. And what if they're deranged or something? Aunt Iris, you worry too much, said Jake reassuringly. Just think about it. If someone wanted to hurt you or Uncle Ken or me even, don't you think they'd have done so already? They'd have plenty of opportunity. I mean, whoever they were, they came right up to you, while you were obliviously unaware of them. You were fast asleep, weren't you? They left flowers at your feet. If they'd really wanted to hurt you, they could have done so already, while you were in that vulnerable position, don't you think? Instead, they did something nice. They left you flowers, and now you're believing they've got to be bad. But I think you're wrong about that. Well, you do make some very good points, Jake, I will admit it. But I can't shake off the feeling that we are being watched. Remind me never to read a scary thriller novel ever again when we're camping in the Ozarks. It's a bad idea, let me tell you. Let's just say I'm feeling incredibly disquieted by these strange, outlandish happenings. I don't like too much enigmatic mystery in my own life. Personally, I like mystery to remain in the books I am reading, not to become a part of my own life. I hate not knowing what's going on, because I don't know whether I should be worried or not. When Iris's husband Ken returned from his walk, he looked very reassured and content. There's not a single soul around the place. Everything is exactly as it should be. We're in the middle of the sticks, aren't we? I don't think we've got anything to worry about. Let's enjoy our camping trip, shall we? And have lots of fun. Don't forget, I've got a machete and some bear spray. So if anybody launches an attack on us, well, I can surprise them, can't I? It's not funny. Ken, I can see you're thinking this is all a big joke. But I have reason to be very, very concerned. I don't think you've got anything to worry about. I'm inclined to agree with Jake over here. If there is a deranged weirdo out there who wishes to harm us, he'd have done so already. Besides, if anyone is here, and they want to hurt us, as I keep telling you, I've got my defensive weapons at my disposal. Oh, honestly, Ken, you really love winding me up, don't you? As if this is all some great big joke. I'm sorry, but I don't find it remotely funny. Someone put firewood in your basket and left flowers for me at my feet while I was asleep. How can you look on such things with nonchalance? I just don't understand it one little bit. Because what they did was nice, said Ken. It was a sweet thing to do. Maybe there's a hermit living out there somewhere. That would make perfect sense to me. Perhaps he hasn't seen any life around these parts for ages, but keeps himself to himself. But decided, when he saw us lurking around, to show us some kindness. And what's wrong with that?" "You really think so?" asked Iris, looking rather sceptical. "Yes, I do, as a matter of fact," said Ken. "It's an explanation that makes sense to me. Put it this way, love. When I was growing up, my father's family had a cabin in West Virginia. A delightful little cabin it was, too. He used to visit it quite regularly, you know. There was a hermit living in a stone and wood hut that he'd erected himself with his own hands, very close to our family cabin. He shouldn't have really done it because it was on our family land, but my father turned a blind eye to it. It was rumoured that this man had abandoned the modern trappings of his life after a nasty divorce with his wife, and had just decided to live on his own. He kept himself to himself, was completely harmless. Such people do exist, you know. Some of them go and live in the Alaskan wilderness and cut themselves off from other human beings, living completely off-grid. It's not as uncommon as you may think, love." "But you think such people exist in this day and age?" "Surely not. But of course I do. We're not all wired the same, love." "But why would they live like that?" asked Iris, finding it almost impossible to believe that anyone in their right mind would choose to live in the middle of nowhere, just for the hell of it would seem. "There are lots of reasons," said Ken. "Some people, well, they perhaps have issues with social interaction. Maybe they're not comfortable with other human beings. They're mavericks who enjoy solitude and peace and quiet, and they get pleasure from living on their own. They have no interest in the material world at all, and all its shallow trappings. They feel a soul connection to the natural world and to the earth, and they enjoy living rough. Nothing wrong with that, if you ask me. If I was living on my own, with no responsibilities, who knows? I might even do the same." "I don't think you would do the same, Ken. That's absolute nonsense." "But that's what you think happened here, is that it? A hermit suddenly decided to leave me flowers?" said Iris, trying to make sense of the strange experience. "Well, I can't think of a better explanation, can you, love?" asked Ken. "Unless, of course, there are lone campers. Well, there's a lone camper out there, trying to show us a little kindness." "So you think we're not in danger?" asked Iris. "Of course we're not in danger, love," said Ken, casting his wife a big smile. "We're going to be just fine." That evening, under the canopy of a tenebrific sky, studded with a plethora of silvery stars, the smell of delicious fish roasting over the barbecue got Iris salivating. It was such an exquisitely beautiful night, as she stared out happily towards the silvery lake, seeing the entire Milky Way reflected on its shimmering surface. The fire crackled merrily as orange flames flickered over the wood. Iris was mesmerized by those flames, lost in thought for a moment. The food was delicious, and the talk even better, and Iris was realizing how much she was enjoying playing a maternal role in Jake's life. He had certainly opened up on this trip, and she was surprised by how much she was growing to like him. Before long they turned in for the night, and the moment they rolled up happily in their warm sleeping bags, the sweet mountain air sent them off to the valley of their dreams. It was early in the morning, before the dawn had finally broken, that Jake woke with a start. He could hear someone moving outside their tent. The front part of the tent seemed to be shaking a little. There was a shuffling sound. What the hell, he thought. Someone is definitely out there. Was it the hermit, he wondered, coming to investigate their campsite in the middle of the night, or early morning rather, while they were all blissfully unaware of this and fast asleep? Whoever he was, this hermit obviously enjoyed being elusive. Curiosity got the better of Jake, so he hurriedly scrambled over to the door of the tent and unzipped the interior. He was suddenly hit by what felt like an ice-cold hand. Jake almost jumped out of his skin with shock. until he realized the ice-cold hand was a huge fish that was swinging backwards and forwards like a pendulum, and seemed big enough to feed at least over 8 people. It had been skillfully hung on the door of the tent, threaded by a long piece of leather, and it had swung straight into his face, giving him the shock of his life. For a brief moment he thought he'd been ambushed by a stranger, but instead the only thing hitting him hard in the face was a freshly caught fish. Who was doing these nice things for them, he wondered? Who was this hermit living here in the Ozarks that was keeping an eye on them? The inky sky seemed to be rolling back like a scroll, as it allowed its dark velvety veil to become perforated with a faint hint of light, so that the sky was gradually becoming more grey than black. Jake began to adjust his eyes to the light, and that was when he observed the distinctive silhouette of what appeared to be a large human being, with an extremely large torso, moving swiftly through the trees and walking away from the campsite. Jake now assumed that this had to be the hermit, and at the very least he'd like to say thank you to the man for the fish that he had left for them. Apart from anything else, he also wanted to reassure Aunt Iris that the stranger who had been doing these nice things for them imposed no threat. He was clearly a harmless, solitary soul, showering them with magnanimous acts of kindness. Jake had slept in his leggings and a long-sleeved vest. They were the kind of things you would wear to the gym, so he was ready to face the elements, and by the light of his torch he hurriedly put on his walking boots, struggling to be as quiet as he could, as he didn't want to disturb both Aunt Iris or Uncle Ken, who thankfully seemed out for the count, and he could hear their quiet snores. Jake had been exceedingly glad to come to the Ozarks with his aunt and uncle. Out here he'd felt so alive, surrounded by the sumptuous grandeur of the natural world. He had found himself opening up to Aunt Iris, and an unlikely bond developing between the two of them. When he'd first moved in with his aunt and uncle, it had been a tough, tumultuous ride for him, especially knowing only too well, by his aunt's rather abrasive manner towards him, that she really didn't want him around, or intruding in their lives. But now things were profoundly different. There had been a big shift since all 3 of them had come to the Ozarks, and for the first time since Jake had lost his mother, he felt genuinely happy. Could it be that the tide had turned, and things were going to get better from now on? He was pretty sure they were. Aunt Iris had profusely apologized to him for being so unwelcoming to him in the beginning, but he realized his hard-hearted aunt, whom initially he'd really disliked, was actually a warm, very loving woman. Jake cautiously crept out of the tent. Even if his uncle or aunt were to hear him, shuffling around, they might just assume he was answering a call of nature. Once Jake was outside the tent, he hurriedly stepped up his speed, because the stranger had all but disappeared. Jake quickly scrambled away from their campsite, over some jutting rocky appendages in the ground and uneven turf, and made his way down the windy, heavily overgrown trail through a labyrinth of trees. He was delighted that the morning was beginning to show her pretty face, as a golden sunrise gladly began to dust the sky in fragments of gold glitter that was beguilingly beautiful. A cool breeze nuzzled his neck, as he tried his level best to follow the rambling, chaotically disorganized path through the trees, where burgeoning creepers, vines, and ferns of every kind fought against each other rambunctiously to gain as much ground space as they possibly could. Jake used his torch very carefully in the woods to navigate his way through the tangled vegetation. He wasn't precisely sure where he was going, but he wasn't too bothered about that, because he was determined to find the hermit. In the distance, Jake was sure that he could see a shadowy silhouette again. That's the hermit, he thought, almost shuddering with delight. Jake hurriedly ran forwards, trying desperately to catch up with the shadowy stranger. "Excuse me, sir!" he cried out. "Excuse me!" All of a sudden, with Jake's attention diverted towards the stranger, and not focusing on where he was going, he hit his head so hard against a formidable overhanging tree branch that packed him such a mighty punch that everything went completely black, and he lost consciousness as he fell onto the ground in a muddled heap. His head was throbbing as he managed with difficulty to open one of his eyes, but it felt as if his eyelids were stuck together with superglue. He felt disorientated, with a similar feeling you have when waking up from a long drawn-out surgical operation, where everything around you seems so ambiguously abstract and foggy, so indefinitely vague. Jake felt as if he was looking at everything through a veil, so that nothing seemed distinct or clear. Where was he wondered, trying his level best to make sense of his new environment that didn't feel remotely familiar. He could hear two people's voices. At first he thought it must be his aunt and uncle, that were engaged in a deep conversation together, but he realized it was not their voices he was hearing, but two voices, strange voices, speaking in a peculiar language, the likes of such he'd never heard before. Makila, ilagilono, agonotola, pasila, agilani, osokola batina, shokolisa, hilapi, kulasikwa. The throbbing headache that was hammering in his head had made his vision somewhat distorted and blurred, and even with one eye beginning to open, his vision seemed impaired. He couldn't comprehend exactly what he was seeing. Surely he was in his sleeping bag back in his tent, having a weird dream of some kind that he'd ultimately be laughing about in the morning with his aunt and uncle. The walloping headache on the side of his head made him feel as if he'd been hit by a sledgehammer. Jeff could not easily raise his head, but he was very conscious the voices he heard were not familiar, and certainly the unorthodox language they were speaking was outlandishly strange. And furthermore, the speed at which these people were speaking together, backwards and forwards, was very impressive. This was the moment of realization that suddenly made Jake almost jump out of his skin, and he would have done so if he'd not been weighed down by the headache from hell that appeared to be anchoring him to the ground, as if he was trapped under a forklift truck and was incapable of being able to move. Jake felt dizzy and nauseously sick. Where was he wondered again. He was not at home, that was for sure. Nor was he in the tent in his sleeping bag, lying next to his aunt and uncle in the Ozarks. His memory came back to him in waves, pitiful waves at that. And then an understanding appeared to be born. A vague, rather blurry memory was triggered and began to play itself in Jake's head, like a video recorder. He began to fit the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. He remembered following the hermit into the woods, and then everything suddenly going black. He wondered if possibly the hermit had attacked him, hitting him hard across the head. It would certainly explain his banging headache. Was he in grave danger, he wondered? Was this hermit he had followed into the woods some kind of deranged lunatic? The idea made his skin crawl in horror. He tried to wake up, but it was a struggle. The heaviness seemed to keep him pinned to the ground. He couldn't move. He tried to wiggle his hands and feet to ensure that they hadn't been shackled by some kind of restraint. But he felt so foggy, so out of it all, as if he'd been heavily drugged. He realized the scratchy feeling from his back was from the ropey tangle of roots on the forest floor. So he was definitely lying on the forest floor. And he could hear the birds in the trees above his head, singing cheerfully. He needed to find out what was going on, but his abject confusion seemed to hijack his full grasp of reality. Jake suddenly decided to tune into the conversation the people were having. Maybe he'd be able to comprehend what they were saying. One of the voices was light, airy, and almost floaty. It sounded distinctly female. The other voice was deep and husky, and was definitely male. The two people, whoever they were engaged in some kind of heated exchange, almost as if they were arguing about something that neither of them could agree on. Jake couldn't believe there were two people out here in the Ozarks. He'd remember following one person most specifically. Were there a couple of foreigners camping out here in the woods? But what language were they speaking? After a while, when the conversation became more mute, he could feel a cool, very large hand feeling his forehead, and then the voices continued all over again. And that was when Jake realized one of the voices was light, airy, and almost floaty. It sounded distinctly female. The other voice was deep, demanding, husk, and very authoritative. It was definitely a male voice. The two people, whoever they were engaged in some kind of heated exchange, almost as if they were arguing about something that neither of them could agree on. Jake couldn't believe that there were two people out here in the Ozarks. He had remembered pacifically following one person into the woods. Were there a couple of foreigners camping out here in the woods? But what language were they speaking? After a while, when the conversation became mute, he could feel a cool, very large hand feeling his forehead, as if testing his temperature. And then the voices continued again, and that was when Jake realized the two people were talking about him. But the voices showed concern, rather than any ill intent, so maybe he wasn't in danger after all. After a mighty struggle, Jake managed to sit up, but his hand went straight to his head, as the pain in his head was excruciating. He was seeing stars, so he could see the blurry outlines of two figures that seemed gigantic in size. His vision was seriously distorted. The cold hand was on him again, patting him gently and saying some soft, soothing words. He didn't understand the nurturing female voice. Then the voice spoke telepathically to him and seemed to communicate with Jeff, as if understanding that there was an obvious language barrier between them. The voice he heard in his head telepathically was the same female voice he'd heard moments before. "You're going to be all right. You stumbled into a tree branch. It gave you a mighty whack to your head. Zoltan will take you back to your camp in due course. Only if you're strong enough, of course. Your parents must be terribly worried about you. You were out cold for a long time. We were worried about your plight. You really should look where you're going. Some of those tree branches around here are pretty hefty. You're lucky you didn't lose an eye. Can you manage to get up?" Jake's eyes were so blurry, but he tried to focus on the figure. And then the fuzziness began to fade, and he realized he was not seeing a regular human being, but an enormous female Bigfoot. This time he rubbed his eyes multiple times because he knew his mind had to be playing tricks on him. It had to be. What he was seeing could not be real, could it? He rubbed his eyes extra vigorously all over again, much like you do with a dirty pair of spectacles that is impairing your vision. After Jeff rubbed his eyes, the circulation improved, and suddenly he was seeing much more clearly, even though his head continued to bang, as if a heavy metal orchestra was playing music in his head. The female Bigfoot was standing there, looking at him through very dark treacle-coloured eyes, registering an expression on her face of grave concern. "I'm not exactly sure you are all right," she said. "I think you should rest a little while longer. You're still somewhat disabled from that nasty whack you took to the head." Jake's head turned towards the other voice that was speaking, and that was when he saw the male Bigfoot, and the size of this creature was extraordinary. He'd never seen anyone so large before. Jeff was sure his eyes were now standing on stalks, because these two massive gargantuan Bigfoots were easily between 9 and 10 foot tall, with bodies masterfully built, powerful shoulders, and extraordinary chests that seemed to ripple with muscle definition. Both of the burly Bigfoots were covered with black hair. The female Bigfoot had a large streak of white hair running down her right arm, which was extremely distinctive. If Jeff had seen these Bigfoots close up and personal, in normal circumstances, he'd have been terrified out of his skin. But he knew he was in the presence of two of the kindest creatures you could ever hope to meet, for they seemed to care passionately about his welfare. The male Bigfoot turned around to talk to Jake directly, his words translating into his head in English. "We've been both arguing about what to do about you. Should we keep you here until you feel stronger, or would you like me to carry you back to camp? I don't think you'll be able to walk on your own. I worry that your parents might be extremely alarmed if they find you are missing." Jake was surprised the Bigfoot was asking him such a direct question. He was trying to get to his feet on his own. but the female Bigfoot assertively put a hand on him to discourage him from attempting to do this. "You're not strong enough to walk," she said. "If you get up, you'll pass out again. Would you like to stay here a little longer, or would you like to be taken back to your camp? We cannot decide what we should do with you." "How long have I been like this?" asked Jake.
"Long enough," said the male Bigfoot. "Why were you following me into the woods so early in the morning, when the sky was still grey? It's very dark and foreboding in these woods. There are a lot of big, lofty trees in here, with treacherously overhanging branches that can knock you out cold. You're lucky that the branch did not kill you. You've got scratches all over that face of yours, and you look like a sorry sight indeed. You appeared to be calling after me, and when I turned around I saw you being flung to your feet by that branch. You were out cold. I tried to wake you up. You gave me quite the start, you did. What did you want with me?"
"I just wanted to thank you for the fish you left us, the flowers you left my Aunt Iris, and for the firewood you collected for my Uncle Ken. We didn't know who was doing these nice things for us, you see."
"I like to help out wherever I can," said the male Bigfoot. "I thought it would be a nice thing to do to leave some flowers for the sweet lady. I left a large fish outside your tent because I could see the old man rarely struggle to get any decent-sized fish on his line. So I thought I'd lend him a helping hand."
"Well, thank you all the same," said Jake. "To answer your question, I'd like to get back to my camp if I may. But, like you were saying, I don't think I can walk." Jake tried to attempt to struggle to his feet, but it was useless. As the moment he got up, his head became profoundly dizzy, and he started to see stars. And then he passed out again, everything going black. Jake woke up moments later when he felt a slight jolting sensation, and he could feel a large pair of arms wrapped around him, and feel the rise and fall of a powerful chest. He realized he was being carried back to his camp by this powerful, kind male Bigfoot that smelt so earthy. He closed his eyes again, feeling no worry or fear. He knew the male Bigfoot would take him safely back to camp, and that was all that mattered, because he knew he'd be safe with Aunt Iris and Uncle Ken. His head was still throbbing violently, but the pain gladly went away when he drifted off into a deep sleep. How long the Bigfoot carried him for he didn't know, for he was out for the count, and had only a vague memory of being carried back to camp. Back at the tent when the dawn had broken, Iris was the first one to rise out of her sleeping bag. Her back felt stiff and exceedingly uncomfortable. She hated sleeping in the tent on the ground, and was desperately missing the comfortable mattress of her king-size bed at home that offered her so much support. Her back was killing her. She knew that this outrageously aggressive outdoor lifestyle was not for her. At least next year, she persuaded herself, the family holiday would be much more luxurious. She could see herself happily sunning herself very contentedly on a glorious beach, with long stretches of golden sand, and a sea that was an aqua blue colour, somewhere tropical, she thought, where they would book into a luxury hotel. She could see herself drinking luxurious cocktails out of a coconut while watching the sun set over the ocean. She'd go somewhere with 5-star menus and a superb spa, where her aching muscles would be soothed by a professional masseur. Right now she could well do with a massage, as every wailing muscle in her entire body was crying out in abject agony. But Iris knew she'd potter along until this trip was over. Where was everyone this morning, she thought? The tent seemed to be very quiet, and for a brief moment she thought that no one was there and she was all on her own. She realized a soft snore was coming from her husband's sleeping bag. He was lying in such a flat position. Was it any wonder she thought that he wasn't even there at all? When she looked at the corner of the tent where Jake was, well, where he was supposed to be sleeping, that was, she noticed his sleeping bag was completely empty. She suspected he'd gone off to answer a call of nature. Either that, or maybe he'd done a bit of exploring all on his own. He was 14 years old, after all, and a sensible, very reliable young man, so she was certain they didn't need to worry very much about him. She knew Jake was thoroughly enjoying his trip to the Ozarks as much as her husband was. The two of them were getting on like a house on fire, it would seem. It really was like Jake had become the son her husband had always wanted. Iris had noticed that when the pair of them had returned from the lake the previous afternoon, that both Jake and her husband had rosy glows to their faces. They had looked relaxed and content, like two people that had enjoyed each other's company very much. Jake would probably consider the holiday that Iris was planning for next year to be a tad on the boring side, but that was too bad, because civilization was Iris's middle name, and there was nothing remotely civilized about collecting water in the morning and having to boil it thoroughly to ensure it was safe to drink. Iris realized she suddenly felt extremely hungry. Her stomach was grumbling. She thought it would be rather nice to make some jungle oats porridge for breakfast, along with a cup of much-needed coffee. She let out a huge yawn. Why was she so famished, she wondered. It has to be the air out here, she thought, revving up my appetite. She glanced down briefly at her watch, to see it was 9 o'clock in the morning. Good grief! Why had she and her husband slept in so late? It was most unlike them to oversleep like this. But then again, it never did you harm to have a good lie-in on occasion. And out here in the Ozarks, you could take your time doing anything at a leisurely pace. There wasn't any hurried scheduled meetings or any pressing appointments out here that needed to be met. Time out here in the Ozarks danced to its own merry rhythm and was answerable to absolutely no one. Maybe that was why her husband Ken loved these trips to the Ozarks so much, as out here in the natural world he probably felt free, like a caged bird finally released in the wild, that could finally stretch out its wings and soar up high into the azure blue sky. Iris decided to quickly get dressed. She put on a pair of leggings, some sneakers, and a long-sleeved sports top, which might protect her from being eaten alive by the mosquitoes. As she opened the tent, something slapped against her face so mightily hard. It felt like a cold hand. Iris nearly fell backwards. She got such a start. She very nearly screamed. She thought someone had violently assaulted her. What the hell, she thought. But she realized swinging in front of the tent was an enormous fish, attached to a long leather thread. Good Lord, she thought. Jake must have gone fishing early this morning. But what a dreadful place to hang a fish. I mean, that thing could have knocked me right out. It gave me one hell of a fright. She marvelled that Jake had caught such a large, impressive fish, and for someone so inexperienced with fishing, to be pulling in a fish like this out of the lake on a second attempt was extraordinary. Ken had only taken Jake out on his first fishing adventure yesterday, and he was already successfully outperforming her husband. The young teenager must have risen very early this morning and ambitiously gone fishing, and he'd not made a sound when he'd left the tent. Iris knew that Ken would not be impressed that Jake had gone fishing without him, but that was too bad. Jake deserved to enjoy some personal time to himself, and after all the devastation he'd been through in losing his mother, she knew that the young teenager's successes would bring Jake a sense of accomplishment, which would help build up his confidence. Humming happily to herself, Iris detached the fish from the front of the tent and proceeded to fillet it to prepare it for frying. She dipped the pieces into a bag of seasoned flour, and then she put them onto a skillet on the gas burner and threw garlic butter and lemon juice over the pieces of fish. The smell was absolutely delicious, and she knew eating fish for breakfast would be far more satisfying than the oatmeal porridge would have been. It was such a magnificently beautiful morning, but it felt so much earlier than 9 o'clock. The sunlight this morning was somewhat subdued and rather reticent, as if it had decided to take a sabbatical all of its own. The somewhat soft lighting was almost ethereal, as its prisms danced on the surface of the water, while a soft breeze caused the trees to shake, as if they were dancing. Where on earth was Jake, she wondered, returning into her tent to look for the pepper that she'd stored away in a Tupperware container, and she knew she'd left it inside the tent somewhere, so she shuffled around to look for it. She heard a strange thumping sound from outside the tent and decided that at least Jake had returned to camp. That was good news. When she walked out of the door of the tent with the pepper in her hand, she found Jake lying on the ground, covered in scratches on his face, and there was a large black bruise around his eye area. But as she asked a somewhat bemused Jake what the hell had happened, he smiled at her and said rather groggily, "Don't worry about the hermit, Aunt Iris. He's nice. He won't hurt you." And then Jake very suddenly drifted off into a big contented sleep, waking hours later with his aunt and uncle standing over him, their faces pale with concern. The story Jake told his aunt and uncle was he'd followed the hermit into the woods and had been knocked out by a tree branch, and the hermit had brought him back to safety.
"Well, we need to thank the hermit for what he did for you," said Aunt Iris.
Jake looked at his aunt and said, "I wouldn't do that, Aunt Iris. The hermit wants to be left well alone." It would seem the trip to the Ozarks was the beginning of an awesome relationship that Jake had with both his aunt and uncle, who still to this very day consider him to be a son. Jake has never told them that the hermit he encountered that day was not as human as they might first believe he was, but some secrets you just don't share. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.